Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar. We are so glad that you could join us today. Forecast, discover risk, understanding what is going on also in our Mediterranean and Africa with our economist will be the theme of our webinar. I would like to tell you that we will record this webinar. Also, we will send you the presentation, and we will ask you to participate to this webinar. So please feel free to send us question through the system. I would like to thank you before starting our Economist. As you know, each and every quarter we publish an important publication, barometer, that was presented in the last country risk conference. And today, our economist, we will go further. So without any further add, I would like to introduce our economist, today's speaker, Bruno de Moura Fernandes, Head of Macroeconomic Research. Thank you. Marcos Carias, Economic Southern Europe. Laurine Pividal, Economist Spain. Seltem Iyigün, Senior Economist for Middle East and Turkey. And Aroni Chaudhuri, Economist Africa. So I leave the floor to Bruno, that he will start with an overview and outlook of global economy. Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Antonella. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, maybe for some of you. Well, the title of this barometer is 2024, the pivotal year. Why pivotal year? Because 2024 is supposed to be the year of the rebound in the second part of the year, and the year, of course, of when monetary institutions will finally start to pivot, will finally start to ease basically their monetary policy. So basically we'll have a change now in the global outlook in the second part of the year. Will it be the case? Well, we'll see that there are plenty of risks ahead of us, and that, well, maybe it will not happen, but yet it's our central scenario. Let's say we'll see finally in 2024 an acceleration, but only in the second part of the year, because 2024 will be, you'll see, basically another year of global slowdown, at least at the global level, even though we'll see that in the regions, maybe it will be a bit different. To start, as always, the commodity prices. And commodity prices do not lie. I think it's important to say that, because it's always supply and demand. Of course, sometimes you can have imbalances, sometimes you can have uncertainty that could, of course, weigh on prices. But what we can see here is that definitely prices are not rebounding. They are even decreasing when we have a look at agricultural prices or natural gas prices. What does it mean? That demand, global demand, is slow. Basically, we are having now a very, very slow global demand, a global activity, and of course, then you can see that in the commodity prices, because we have to say also that even when we have a look at oil prices, well, even though there are plenty of tensions in the Red Sea, of course, in Middle East, Seltem will say a few words on that, we are not seeing high oil prices. It's true, they're not that low. Of course, they remain much higher than in the last decade as all the rest of commodity prices. But again, oil prices are around $80 despite all the tensions in such an important region for this commodity as Middle East. And this also despite the fact that OPEC countries have cut further the production, or at least have extended their cut in production. So it means that there are not such an increase, let's say, in supply. But yes, also we have to say the US, also Brazil, are producing a lot, even more than expected. So the non-OPEC countries are producing more oil, is bringing, of course, more supply into the market, but also demand is still low. So that's why for the moment we are not forecasting an increase, or at least a rebound in commodity prices. We think they will remain at this level at least during the first half of 2024, because again, for the moment, global activity is slow. And of course, the good news is that these, let's say, low commodity prices, or at least the fact that commodity prices are lower than last year, is of course continue to drive down inflation. What you can see here is that in Eurozone, in the US, inflation is going down. But of course, now maybe we are reaching the last mile. As in the marathon, basically the last mile is always the hardest. Why? Well, because now we see that energy contribution is negative or very low, and so of course now what we'll see is goods and maybe more important, services prices. We were already saying that 4 months ago that service prices will remain quite dynamic. Why? Because of wages. In Eurozone, wages are increasing around 4%. As always, inflation starts to go up, and then wages start to catch up. But there is a moment when wages increase a bit faster than inflation. It's when inflation is going down. Wages do not go down as quick as inflation. So for a moment, during the first half of 2024, it's quite likely that wages will remain quite buoyant with sharp, still strong labor market. So maybe around 3.5, 4% increase in wages. And so it means that, of course, costs for services companies will remain high, and then we'll have still high inflation on services. So that's why we think that inflation will maybe reach 2% during months, but then maybe it will be hard to keep it at 2%, or at least below, let's say, the 3%. And so that's why we think that, well, inflation, the battle against inflation is not won yet. And that's why also the central banks maybe are being more cautious than the markets would have expected, because once again, there are a risk. This risk is very important. The risk are tensions in the Red Sea. You know that basically there are plenty of Houthis attacks over the last weeks, over the last couple of months. It's true, the intensity has been reduced after the attacks of the US and the UK on Houthis allies. But well, what we are seeing now is that for the moment, of course, many ships are just not going through the Suez Canal. As you can see, it has dropped. And then what they do is that they go through the Cape of Good Hope. It increased basically the delays by more than 10 days. And so, of course, it means also, let's say, supply chain disruption, and also, of course, increase in transport costs. So, of course, this is a threat, because if it lasts, then we'll have issues, because we'll have higher good prices, again, because of some scarcity of goods. For the moment, we are not seeing that much. Only a couple of companies have announced that they are suspending their production temporarily, like Volvo or like Tesla. But of course, if it were to last or even to escalate, then we could have issues on the supply and the global supply chains, and then of course it could fuel even further inflation. So that's why also central banks are being cautious and are waiting basically the next months to see the data, the wage data, but also of course how these geopolitical issues, the next development of these geopolitical issues. So for the moment, central banks policy rates remain high. We think they won't cut before, let's say, June or July at least, and then it will depend, of course, on the figures I mentioned. Then they could even wait, at least in the Eurozone, September or October, if inflation were to prove maybe more resilient than expected, or if labor markets were to prove more, stronger than expected, and then wages also to increase further than expected. In any case, here the message is to say, for the moment and during 2024, interest rates will remain very high. In any case, even if central banks start to cut, basically they will only cut 3 or 4 times. So it means that interest rates will remain for companies, at least in Eurozone, around 4% maybe at the very lowest, and so still much higher financing costs than when these companies got loans a couple of years ago. So of course now it will be harder for companies to get more finance, and so of course then they will have an impact on insolvencies. The global scenario, the global GDP growth forecast for us is 2.3% in 2024. It means that, again, we're not talking about a recession despite all the risks we've mentioned, but again, further slowdown and of course, much slower growth than in the last decade. So basically, we will have 2 years of low growth to bring inflation down gradually. Here, the US also will slow down. China is expected to slow down also. So many, let's say, all the biggest engines of the global activity, as the Eurozone also, will remain slow. And so, of course, that's why it's bringing down global GDP growth. Then, of course, we'll have some emerging countries doing pretty well. I'm sure that our colleagues from the Middle East and also from Africa will mention a couple of these, but also, for instance, the Asian countries we expect them to do pretty well, like for instance in Singapore, in Vietnam, in Malaysia, or even, for instance, Indonesia. We think that definitely there is some source of growth. Maybe the positive side is more on emerging countries in 2024 than in advanced economies or even in China. As I mentioned, I think something very important to keep in mind is that even though, well, global activity is expected to maybe pick up in second half of 2024, business insolvencies, we expect them to keep on growing in 2024. Why? Because the trend is there. Every month we compare with 2019, with the same months on 2019. For instance, in 2023, we compare March 2023 to March 2019. April 2023, we compare to April 2019. What you can see is that in every biggest economy in the global economy, what we are seeing now is definitely we are back to 2019 levels at least. And then you can see that the trend is definitely clear. We are increasing. In business insolvencies are increasing. In France, we are much above 2019 levels. In the UK, also in Canada, but everywhere now the trend is clear. So we think that it will continue because once again, all these things of very high interest rates will mean that now it will be harder for companies, also because wages will remain dynamic, and so it means higher cost for companies, while demand will not pick up before the second half of the year. So we expect business insolvencies to keep on rising, at least during the first half of the year. And so once again, do not forget this, I think, this risk, because it can have a sharp impact on the global economy, because then it will mean also higher unemployment and so on. A very quick overview of our country risk assessments. Basically, even though I mentioned quite many risks and the fact that for the moment the global economy is being slow, well, the fact is that we have downgraded almost 100 countries after the pandemic and after the war, the start of the war in Ukraine. So now it's also the moment to upgrade back some of these countries, maybe the most buoyant of them. So we have upgraded 12 countries and only one downgrade. Only one downgrade, Israel. I'll let, of course, Seltem say a few words on that. But regarding the upgrades, we can mention that Switzerland or Denmark are back to A1, so basically very low risk. Norway is not alone anymore. And also it's true, we think some dynamic countries in Europe like Romania or Croatia will benefit from very, very high European funds and who basically have reached the bottom, and now we expect them to rebound. Also, I get that Aroni will say a few words on Namibia and Mauritius that were upgraded back to B and A4. So let's say some good news on emerging countries, but again, for many of the most important economies for the moment, we keep them at, let's say, the CRA or the country risk assessment, but maybe we can expect, if things go well, the next round, maybe a bit more of upgrades if really global economy rebounds. And in terms of sectors, basically also more upgrades than downgrades, but I would say very concentrated on automotive sector, back to medium. In Asia, also in Eastern Europe, well, things are going a bit better for this sector, basically back to 2019 levels in terms of registrations, in terms of production. Also, energy sector, let's say, as we do not fear any disruptions anymore, it's back to medium. And then in terms of downgrades, well, let's say maybe some downgrades of the paper sector because it's very intensive, energy intensive, and also because the demand for design paper and also for online commerce, basically for e-commerce, is not very dynamic. So we do not expect any, let's say, improve in the outlook of the paper sector in Europe. But once again, more upgrades than downgrades, because once again, now we can expect in the coming months, in the second half of 2024, a gradual improvement for many sectors and for many countries, because, well, we are supposed to have reached the bottom, let's say, during the first half of 2024, even though, once again, do not forget there are plenty of risks and uncertainty, so we cannot take it for granted. Now, I give the floor to the team, who will start with basically Marcos, who will say a few words on Italy and Greece.
Thanks, Bruno. The outlook for Southern Europe, for Italy and for Greece, is pretty much in line with many of the things you just said. Mostly I'm thinking about this dynamic of catch-up of wages as inflation is going down. We can see this in the next slide. So we expect the Italian economy, after a couple of years where it was mostly stagnant, of course, hit by the energy crisis, to recover growth rates that are in line with what we used to see with the pre-pandemic Italian economy. So a steady recovery, but not by any means a boom dynamic. And the main protagonist of this growth story will be private consumption. So of course, this catch up in wages, which has not been as strong in Italy as with European partners, means that this catch up is more in front of us than behind us. At the same time, where we are experiencing strong disinflation, meaning that we can expect faster growth in consumption. Otherwise, also these lower global energy prices are leading to an improvement in the competitiveness of firms, assuming, of course, nothing goes markedly wrong on the geopolitical scene in this year. It's important also to take into account the role of European funds, of this public investment facilitated by the European Union, which has so far played a very strong and positive role. We know that we are noticing that the public administration has increasingly evident difficulties in administrating and investing these funds as quickly as it was expected in the plans. So of course, this not only leads to public investment that grows more slowly than was expected, but also it is harmful to the confidence of the private sector, because of course there were a lot of firms that were pricing in that a lot of maybe infrastructure projects would be finished quickly, faster. And so the productivity gains that are expected from these infrastructure projects are taking less time to materialize, leading also to a slower dynamic in private investment. This also combined with the fact that we are having declining profit margins after a period where we saw strong growth in profits, it leads us to be a little bit more pessimistic about the dynamic in private investment. Going back to what Bruno was showing us with the dynamic of insolvencies, it is worth noting that here Italy is a notable exception, because insolvencies, despite the fact that they have been growing throughout last year, are still some 30% underneath their pre-pandemic levels. We can see this more clearly in the next slide. And it's exactly what you have here on the graph on the left, which shows you that, yes, we are now in a firmly established growing trend when it comes to corporate insolvencies, but still markedly under pre-pandemic levels. We have reasons to believe that this growing trend will continue in the next year, because we still have restrictive monetary conditions, this higher for longer environment in interest rates. And even though, as I said, we are going into an improvement in the GDP growth dynamic, we have to take into account that usually insolvencies respond to fluctuations of GDP with a lag. They don't respond straight away. There can be a lag of many quarters. And so what we expect to see next year is still the effects of the stagnating growth dynamic that we saw during last year. An important fact to take into account also when we look at the graph on the right is that curiously we saw this increase in insolvencies happen more or less at the same time in all of the sectors of the economy, meaning at the beginning of last year, which lets us know that this is a macroeconomically driven phenomenon. Turning from insolvencies to the subject of payment delays, there is data that has been recently released from a survey conducted by the European Union, by the European Commission, which gives us an insight about what's happening on payment delays. And here we see patterns that are quite similar to those that we see in insolvencies. Meaning, if we look at the graph here on the left, that the prevalence of payment delays is still lower than what we used to have in 2019 before the pandemic, but we are seeing an increasing trend both in Italy and in the European Union, what we see in the right. But however, we see that in the European Union, we are broadly back at the same levels of payment delays that we had before the pandemic, whereas in Italy, we are still not at that stage yet, but we are in an increasing trend. Finally, it's useful to consider the consequences of these payment delays, because the survey of the European Commission also asks firms, to the extent that you are having payment delays, how are these affecting your day-to-day operations? And what we notice is that firms are containing the consequences of these payment delays in their operational dimensions, meaning that they are not affecting their relationships with suppliers as much as they used to be. They are not affecting recruitment and investment or their everyday operational activities. But however, we must consider that they are affecting the credit worthiness of firms with regards to their creditors, their ability to their likelihood to be repaying their debts. It is not as bad as before the pandemic, but we see a clearly increasing trend, and this is important to take into account as we go into next year. Finally, a few words on Greece. Generally good news, and particularly the fact, as you might have heard, that over the past quarter, rating agencies have been improving, upgrading their sovereign evaluation of the credit worthiness of the Greek state, and this is having an important and noticeable effect on capital flows. We can see it here on the graph on the left, on the fact that obviously, as one could expect, the yields on Greek government debt have been going down significantly, but also, as we see on the graph on the right, that foreign direct investment flows into Greece following the upgrade by S&P have never been as high. We have to go back to before the 08 crisis to see inflows of this scale, which is quite logical because now foreign investors are more free to allocate capital. So this can also be expected to be supporting the growth trajectory of Greece in the following years, and it is expected to be still one of the better success stories in the European economy.
So hello everyone. So can you hear me?
Yes, go on, please.
So, yeah, thank you. So let's first focus on the last estimates of the Spanish economy, which reveal that the country ended 2023 with better than expected quarterly GDP growth in the last quarter, and it also confirmed the resilience of the Spanish economy compared to other European economies. So this positive performance has, all in all, allowed the Spanish economy to close 2023 with an annual growth of 2.5%. And as we can see in the graph on the left, this robustness is mostly driven by the resilience of household consumption throughout the year. And even if it's not so dynamic, it has also finally returned to pre-pandemic level at the end of the year. And we expect household consumption to remain a key growth driver in Spain in the coming months due to the rise in real incomes as inflationary pressures moderate and wage dynamics. On the side of net export, we can see that they finally contributed positively to GDP in the final quarter of 2023 after 2 negative quarters in a row. But when we look ahead, even if there should be a gradual improvement by the end of the year, we don't really expect them to contribute significantly to 2024 growth due to the continued weak external demand and the return to normalize market trend in the tourism sector after they came back to pre-pandemic level last year. But what should be noted here is that Spanish economic resilience is also suffering from a decrease in investment with a second consecutive quarter contraction. But we will come back to this later. And as we can see on the right graph, both machinery and construction investment are still far away pre-pandemic level. So in short, in this context of high interest rates, continuous financial pressure, weak external demand, we forecast that Spanish economy to decelerate this year and to be mostly driven by household consumption. But by considering this better than expected GDP growth in the last quarter of last year, we also revised upward our 2024 growth forecast to 1.6%, which is still above the euro area average. So as we just saw, investment has contracted in recent months, and as the transmission of tightening of monetary policy to financing costs and bank credit has continued, and as we see now, it affected even more the private sector. And so, as we can see on the left graph, the cost of new bank financing operations for households and companies, as well as the average cost of outstanding debt, have continued to increase in recent months. And for the new financing operation, non-financial cooperation and individual entrepreneurs have faced higher increases in credit costs from the start of the monetary tightening cycle, but also in the recent months, as we can see in green, which explains the slowdown in total investments in the last quarter. And so in this context, as we can see on the right, the contraction in the financing balance of the private sector has been accentuated at the end of 2023, especially for companies and individual entrepreneurs, in contrast to consumers that have maintained positive growth rates. And as interest rates should remain high over the coming quarters, we should expect that this negative trend to pursue as companies will face continuous substantial financial costs. But in this gloomy outlook, investments will nevertheless still be supported by European funds, since less than a third of the total amount was actually disbursed until now. So disbursements are expected to accelerate sharply in the coming quarters or coming years, but it will also depend of the political environment in Spain, as we have currently some uncertainties with the coalition forming with the pro-Catalan parties. So now I will leave the floor to Aroni, who will give you an outlook on Africa.
Okay, thank you very much, Aroni. The floor is yours.
Hello everyone. So for the Africa outlook, I'll begin by a more general outlook very quickly. My scenario has not really changed since the last time. There will be a slight rebound in growth on the continent below potential, and there will be significant differences between commodity exporters, who will be suffering from lower commodity prices, as Bruno said, and the more diversified economies that depend on domestic demand, which will show much stronger postings, and we'll see it with Kenya afterwards. Also, Bruno did mention that we did upgrade two countries again. after the last quarter. This is mainly to bring back some of these countries to their pre-pandemic assessment grades. When we estimate that the macroeconomic balances are now stable enough that the country's growth trajectory is now on a more sustainable path, we are inclined to upgrade. And for Namibia specifically, the fiscal consolidation efforts are paying dividends, and so that is why we brought it back to B, which is closer to the assessment level of the economies around it in the southern tip of Africa. So we're talking about a pivot year. So this time I wanted to concentrate on 3 countries where it is indeed a pivot year, starting with Nigeria, and we are not going to talk about their loss in the African Cup of Nations. I think that they've taken that already hard on themselves. However, Nigeria is currently in a very strong policy shift. So the first step was the removal of the fuel subsidy. And the most significant one is, of course, the unification of the exchange rates and the move towards a floating exchange rate regime. So obviously, the very large devaluation in February was a step towards that. It is also, so it was around minus 40%. It is also a signal that the Nigerian authorities are sending to the world that they're committed to this policy shift. So it is a step in the right direction for what they hope to achieve, which is bring back more foreign capital into the Nigerian economy in the medium term. However, this is not yet enough for investors to gain enough confidence in the economy to really start reinvesting more massively towards it, simply because there are still market distortions that are created by official dealers that actually do not apply the official rate, although now it is closer to the parallel rate, and also simply because the flow of dollars is not yet to be seen in a quite strong way in the Nigerian economy, which is what investors are waiting for, to be sure that when they invest, they will be able to repatriate their earnings, which is the main issue now. So definitely a step in the right direction, but there needs to be more measures that to be implemented. And the Nigerian authorities did announce that now they would sanction more strongly dealers that would, try to manipulate the exchange rate market. Obviously, with policy shifts of this size, there are always effects on the real economy, and with strong devaluations, obviously, it has a strong effect on inflation. You can see that inflation is increasing quite strongly and quite a fast pace in Nigeria. This is due to both the official exchange rate, which has obviously taken this big devaluation, but also because the currency is also depreciating on the parallel market on which 60% of the economy operates. So this means that in terms of growth outlook, there will be a slowdown of the Nigerian economy, and I think that it will be more towards the 2.5%, because we can already see the impact of inflation, especially on services. And so that in itself is detrimental in the next 2 years, I'd say, for Nigeria, because of its population growth rate and the size of its demographics. So definitely, but in the longer term, this should benefit Nigeria in the sense that it should restore foreign investment flows and resolve these currency shortages issues. The second country I want to focus on is Kenya. I think it's a very important one in the current context. So first of all, we have to say that the Kenyan economy, in terms of growth and in terms of its growth drivers, still remains a very strong point on the African continent. The rebound that you can see here through 2023 is mainly on the back of agriculture, because agriculture suffered a lot in 2022 from the massive drought in Eastern Africa. But you can also see that services are also rebounding, which is basically because of the disinflation in Kenya. So although the shilling was quite weak last year, this disinflation process, as in other parts of the world on the back of lower commodity prices, also functioned in Kenya. And so that is why there is a rebound in the economy. However, we do expect the economy to slow, not massively, but to slow, because of the fiscal consolidation that is in place and that is quite likely to be reinforced in this year and next year, simply because the main risk on Kenya, and we already said that, is the potential default on its external debt. On that front, I would say that the risks have eased slightly in recent weeks. One, because as you can see, despite the level of foreign exchange reserves being quite low, so just above 4 months, they have not declined much further in 2023, which is already something that is positive. Also, if you look at a breakdown, the official reserves have declined, but actually the amount of reserve that are in the commercial banks in the Kenyan banking sectors have actually increased. So there is always an option, although it is not one that central banks generally prefer, to increase the reserve requirement ratios in order to extend the amount of official reserve. But obviously that has to be done very carefully because there are risks to financial stability. But the option is there in case of an emergency. And also, most importantly, recently some bond markets, Eurobond markets, have opened up again to some African economies, so Cote d'Ivoire being the first one, mainly because now they're pricing in the monetary easing that will begin in the course of the year in the advanced central banks. So here Kenya has got an option to refinance, and if they manage to refinance enough of that 2 billion Eurobond payment in June, that means that they will avoid the default, and that will basically put Kenya's midterm trajectory into a much more positive and sustainable way. However, this also means that if they refinance, the fiscal consolidation will have to continue. And if you look at Kenya's growth model, that will always obviously have some effects on domestic demand, on investment. And so there will be a slowdown in the economy. But the Kenyan economy remains a very strong economy, notably because it's highly diversified compared with other African peers. Lastly, and importantly, South Africa. So pivot year, of course, there are elections this year, and they will be looked at by the rest of the world, especially because South Africa is also a member of the BRICS. So in terms of growth, we did have a slowdown in the third quarter, which was expected if we look at advanced activity indicators, but also if you're cognizant of the fact that there is a huge logistical crisis regarding Transnet that has come and added to the energy crisis that the country has been for the past 2 years. So here, as you can see, the lesser contribution of agricultural, mining, and manufacturing is mostly due to obviously electricity supply concerns, but that have improved actually in recent months. But mainly because of the logistical constraints, we are talking about 3 industries that are heavily export-oriented. Manufacturing through automotive, notably, where the risk of logistical bottlenecks is actually one of the main risks highlighted by the South African automotive sector. Services were the growth driver, as they have been through for the past couple of years, and that is also on the back of financial services, which always do well, but also personal services will also show that there is some extent of the disinflation that is also expressing itself in those services. However, if we do talk about the inflation trajectory, there has been a strong disinflation, but right now it has stopped a bit. It is still sticking above the midpoint, which is 4.5%, which is the target of the Reserve Bank in terms of inflation by 2025. And it is sticky because there are still price pressures on food. The rand is still weak. And it is not expected to rebound very strongly either in the course of the year. Core inflation is also sticky, which is because of services prices are also quite buoyant, although transport prices have declined on the back of fuel. What this basically means is that in terms of monetary policy, there will be a pivot also of the SARB during the year, most probably, but the extent of this pivot will not be I think extremely strong, because they will still wait for the signals that the headline inflation is going towards that midpoint. They will obviously wait for the easing of the Fed to begin, because that is what they have followed, since the tightening cycle in 2022. But also, it might not necessarily be of the same extent as the tightening, simply because maybe they do want to keep. They do want the rand to be a bit stronger versus the dollar, considering the trajectory of inflation. In terms of the elections, well, polls currently show that the ANC does not have the absolute majority. However, we still have to be careful, because polls in South Africa are not always reliable, and the moment that the election comes, the grassroots voter rate of the ANC still remains strong. So it yet has to be seen if the South African political scene is ready to shift towards a coalition with the Democratic Alliance and the Economic Freedom Fighters, or if this time the ANC does retain its absolute majority. So we'll see this in the next couple of months. The elections are due perhaps in May. I want to finish on a more global topic, topic because it is something that has been asked to us, a point of interest, which is basically the political stability on the continent. So here the approach that I want to take for this webinar was to show you the coup d'etat in particular, and to really answer the question, has there been a very strong resurgence? Can we talk about contagion risks? So the way we decided to show it in this map is that here you have the number of coup d'etat in each country, divided by the number of years that the country was in the sample during the period. So for instance, here the period is 1952 to 1989, which is basically the Cold War period. And the reason why it is the number of years that the country is in the sample is because in this period, not all countries on the African continent were independent at the same time. So it makes sense to only show them when they were actually independent nations. So as you can see, obviously, this period was very unstable, and it's normal. It's the decolonization process. It's the Cold War. So that is quite normal. If you go on to the next period, which is 1990 to 2001, you can see that the number of coup has significantly decreased if you take the number of countries that are concerned, but they have remained quite intense in Western Africa, in the Saharan zone, and also a bit in North Africa. If you go again 10 years later, from 2002 to 2019, where generally there was a consensus that the number of coups and the political stability had improved on the African continent, you can see that there are still zones indeed that there are less countries which are in red. So the intensity, the frequency of coups didn't indeed decrease, but there are still numerous countries that are affected, and this Sahelian zone was still the most unstable one. So fast forward to 2020, which is when we had this question, this resurgence of coup, what is happening? You can see that indeed, since the sample size is much smaller, the intensity is also higher. But here it is really to highlight the fact that indeed, the region that is concerned here, if you take Gabon as an outlier, although it is linked regionally speaking, it is the Sahelian zone. And obviously it is because it is the zone where there were the most security risks, where France basically withdrew troops. And also it also reattaches to the general idea that the view of democracy on the African continent is now being quite challenged. There's a disillusion with the process, with the elites, the rougher conditions of living, a distrust in the institution, and so on. So this is just to say that indeed, in one way, we can say that there has been a resurgence in coup, but we have to limit it right now to this region because it is not something that is widespread on the continent. And so it should not kind of distort the view on what political stability might be on the continent. That being said, it is also true that, and we had the most recent example with Senegal, that you don't necessarily need a coup d'etat for the democratic process to be stopped. And that is what happened with what Macky Sall did. So people are talking about the constitutional coup. People in the Senegalese street say that the president has become kings, and there are these kind of risks exist in other countries as well. And actually, if you really look at it, true democratic processes on the African continent, I think that you can count them on two hands out of the 54 countries. So definitely something which we will monitor, but just to put this question a bit into perspective.
Thank you very much. Now the floor is to Seltem. Seltem will talk about Middle East and Turkey economic outlook. Thank you, Seltem.
Thank you, everyone. So this time we're going to start the presentation with Israel. As Bruno said, we downgraded the country to A3 from A2 in the last quarter of last year. So actually, even before the war, there were already some preliminary signs of weakening of the Israeli economy due to the high inflation and higher interest rates that had limited the access of companies to the banking loans. But also there was this efforts of the government to pass a judicial reform without a broad consensus, which also had created some social tensions. But due to all these reasons, and with the start of the war, we revised down our growth forecast to 1.2%. To 1.5% from 2.5%, mainly due to the collapse of around 350,000 reservists, which is about 10% of the country's labor force. and the lack of workers in many sectors. Also, the central bank's cautious stance to counter inflationary pressures and high level of integration of the Israeli economy with the rest of the world in an environment where the global trade is expected to slow will also contribute to a more subdued growth in 2024. So we're going to see in the next slide. So because of the similar reasons, we see that there's a slowdown in industrial production as well. We consider that the risks on the construction and agri-food sectors, services, retail, and ICT have increased during this period. So the key problems, key challenges, for example, for the construction and agri-food sectors are similar. So there's a shortage of workers. For the services sector, there's a problem due to the supply chains and disrupted logistic roads, and also tourism will be affected. Regarding the retail sectors, we see recently that retail sales have declined due to the uncertainty within the economy and the still increased level of banking finance. And lastly, the ICT sector was actually hit by the decline in the business environment sentiment, but this process has started before the war, and due to this reform efforts of the governments in the judiciary, and the slowdown in the global economy has also affected the ICT sector, but now it becomes harder to raise capital funds which are looking for investing in Israeli startups. So this will take a period of time to improve, but we still consider that there are some risks concerning the economy. So a slower growth and lower profit margins and wider fiscal deficits will also increase the debt burden of the government. So in 2024, Israel's fiscal deficit is expected to reach around 5% of its GDP from around 4% due to this expenditures related to the war conditions. Consequently, we expect the debt to GDP ratio to increase to around 66% of GDP from around between 60-62%. Regarding the geopolitical risks, we can say that Israel's widening ground invasion in Gaza and attacks between Israeli-related groups in Iran-related groups in Lebanon, in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, along with domestic political pressures from right wing, indicates that the risks for the war to expand are still persisting, but mounting international pressures on Israel to stop the war, to adopt a ceasefire situation, may avoid the regionalization of the war, actually. So therefore, we're going to stick to our baseline scenario that the war will mostly remain limited within the Gaza, and but the clashes between Israel and Iran-backed groups may continue out of the country, but even without a full-scale war, the economy will continue to be affected negatively, although to a lesser extent compared with the last quarter of last year. And the shipping companies have started to divert their roads away from the Red Sea because of these Houthi attacks. And so despite the international coalition that has been formed to intervene on these attacks, we consider that the risks are still there. And what will go on in the Red Sea will depend what the attacks from this group will look like, actually. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So for Turkey, the 2024 will be an economic rebalancing year. So we expect the end-year inflation to slow down to from 65% last year to 42% this year. The current account deficit to GDP ratio to narrow from 5% to 3.5%, and the growth to slow from around 4% to 3%. So this is basically related to the implementation of tighter monetary and fiscal policies since the second half of last year. And there is, although we expect the inflation to start easing since the after reaching its peak in May 2024, inflationary pressures can still remain on the upside because of the sticky inflation in the services sector, the structural problems in the agri-food sector, and also the gradual depreciation of the lira. So, but we consider that this politics will continue after the election on March 13th, which is actually a local election. So we don't expect a deterioration in the inflation outlook or in the rebalancing process as long as this tighter monetary and fiscal policies remain in place. So in the next slide, we will see how GCC countries will perform this year. So thanks to the increase in the oil output, we will see that the GCC countries will have higher growth performance this year. So as a region, we expect GCC growth to reach 3.4% this year compared with 1.5% last year. So this will be due to the slight increase in oil production, which is expected to rise by around 5%, by around 0.3%, sorry, this year compared with a falling of around 5% last year. So this will provide some support to the growth performance. On the other hand, we see that the non-oil private sector also remains robust. So this year, most probably, the investments, thanks to an increased revenues coming from the oil sales and government expenditures and slower interest rates that will support private consumption will be key drivers of the growth rates across the region. However, in Kuwait, the lack of reforms and the fiscal consolidation in Oman will be restrictive factors in those countries. So in the next slide, we will see that the non-oil economy is still performs still quite resistantly. Both in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, we see a small slowdown in the pace of growth of the PMI index, which is a good indicator of the non-oil economy expansion. So mainly we see that new businesses and new orders remain high, and so this is a supporting factor despite higher competition and elevated cost pressures. And but because of the currencies of these countries are pegged to the US dollar, the central banks of the region are expected to follow the footsteps of the US Federal Reserve. So when the US Fed will start to cut its rate, we expect the GCC central banks to adopt this easier monetary policy as well. So this will allow a greater access of GCC corporates to the banking loans towards the end of the year. So if we move on to the next slide, so that will be the last slide. So recently we have revised up the risk outlook in sectors in Israel, and namely the ICT, retail, and agri-food. For Turkey, we are at the same level of risk aversion, and so the higher oil prices are expected to provide more positive outlook for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates sectors in 2024. So thank you for your attention. I'm going to leave the floor to Antonella now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this important update. Now it's the time to have some question, and I ask all the economists to open the camera. So 2024 is a decisive year, no? And uncertain. Half of the population will go to vote for presidential or legislative election. So, starting from Bruno, GDP growth of USA is declining from 2.5 to 1.6, and we will have the election. So, how do you see US election, and which impact could it have for the global outlook, given the importance of this country? Thank you.
Well, I think that as usually, the key word I think is uncertainty, because yes, I mean the outcome of these elections are very uncertain. It's true. It's very likely that the two candidates will be Donald Trump and Joe Biden. But then, I mean, who knows who can win? It's true that in the polls, some polls say that Joe Biden is well positioned to win, maybe in the 5 swing states. Maybe Donald Trump can win also. So I think that, well, basically, if Joe Biden wins, basically it will be as it has been in the last couple of years. But if, of course, Donald Trump wins, then, of course, he's quite unpredictable. He has mentioned that basically, well, he will implement taxes on all the imported goods. Sometimes he mentioned 10% on all imported goods. So, of course, it could cause huge disruptions in global trade. Of course, then he also mentioned that maybe he could implement 100% on import from China. So, well, we could have a trade war. Also, of course, then there is a question of geopolitical tensions. He said that, well, he would leave Russia to attack any NATO country who would not pay the right price. So once again, we do not know what would be his position on Ukraine. Also regarding Taiwan, regarding China, regarding North Korea, regarding Middle East. So yes, very unpredictable. It's really tough to know if he's bluffing or not in some of his speeches. But yes, what we can know is that yes, definitely there are risks of tension, higher risks, higher uncertainty if Donald Trump wins. But once again, really hard to say 8 months before, 9 months before who will win this election. But of course, we'll have to monitor that very carefully because it will have a huge impact on the US, but also, of course, on global trade, global economy, and of course, geopolitical environment.
Thank you, Bruno. So, Marcos, let's go to Italy, your focus country. What will be the consequence for the Italian economy if the constitutional reform proposed by the government passed?
Yes, so just as a reminder, the current government has recently proposed a constitutional reform under which the prime minister will be elected directly by the voters, as opposed to the current system where it is elected by Congress. And of course, given that the Italian parliament is so fragmented, this has led to the well-known situation in Italy where there are frequent and recurrent changes of government and collapses of government by votes of no confidence, as we saw with Mario Draghi most recently. So it is essentially a reform that would greatly strengthen the role of the prime minister and would theoretically lead to more stable governments and prevent the establishment of technocratic governments that are not elected by the people and that are not politicians, basically. I think that there is an argument to consider that such a reform would favor the political stability of the country, in the sense that it would create room for more reliable partners with the European Union, especially in order that this is an important role, an important consideration, given that this relationship is so important for so many things. It's important for the proper implementation of European funds, but also for the guardrails that the ECB has regarding the risk of sovereign debt. You know, of sovereign crisis, the TPI, that would require the government to be in a good relationship with Brussels in order to be applied. Of course, the risk to this is that, well, it all depends. If your elected prime minister is not the kind to seek a good relationship with the European Union, then it's the risk goes in a different direction. But under the current equilibrium, we see that the Meloni government is one that is ascendant on the European sphere. That is maybe going to have a stronger result in the European Parliament elections that are upcoming, and that has shown a willingness for pragmatism. Of course, so no without risk. And it is just worth saying that at least on its first form, on its first parliamentary vote, this is of course a constitutional reform. So the requirements for its implementation are quite stringent, and it is not expected to have enough votes to pass. But following that, it is expected to go into referendum. So of course, high stakes reform. Potentially under the current equilibrium, good for political stability, but not without its risk, of course.
Thank you, Marcos. Going back to the existing election that we are expected this year, Portugal is one of these. Laurine, what outcome should we expect from this election, and what consequence on the economy of the country regarding this election? What do you think?
So yes, as we know, this year will be quite intense in terms of election around the world, and Portugal is no exception for it to call for snap election last November. And as said Bruno, for the year, the key word for the outcome of this legislative election is also uncertainty, even if it will occur in the month. Because despite the corruption scandal that led to the resignation of the socialist prime minister in November, the latest polls show a situation where the Socialist Party and the center-right opposition, which name is the Democratic Alliance, are neck and neck in terms of votes, but each party should fall short of an absolute majority. So with this outcome, and according to the latest poll, a right-wing coalition, including the far-right party Chega, will win more votes than the left-wing coalitions. And in the last month, the far-right party is indeed gaining support, and it could then be key in forming a government. But at the moment, the Democratic Party has rejected any type of agreement with Chega. And so the fragmentation of votes is expected to make government formation challenging in Portugal. And if a coalition were to form, it could make the governance difficult and increase the risk of political instability, diverging opinion and interest among the partners parties. And at the same time, a possible political deadlock is likely to delay further the implementation of plans to invest the European funds, for example, which have deadlines agreement with the European Union.
I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I can't hear you, Antonella.
Sorry, I was on mute, thank you. Going back to a region where there is a geopolitical risk concrete, as you show, Aroni, looking to another part of the risk. How do you see and how could the overall slowdown in China can affect the African economies, in particular the one dependent on demand, on Chinese demand and fundings? What is your opinion?
Well, I think that we have to approach it with nuance. Indeed, if we look at the direction that the Chinese economy is taking, and in terms of the economic growth model, which is shifting towards a consumption-based economy, well, one can assume that basically the need of its heavier industries for raw materials will decrease with time. And this is true in the medium to long term. However, I think that we have to differentiate, and this will be according to the goals that the Chinese authorities set for the direction that the Chinese economy takes. So indeed, if we do follow a growth model like this, steel exporters, so for instance, South Africa, or oil exporters might be affected more strongly by the general slowdown of the growth pace in China, because the heavy polluting industries, which were the mainstay of the Chinese economy for the past 2 decades, are likely to be less important in the weight of GDP. That being said, China has also clearly announced and is clearly showing its ambition to become one of the, if not the global leader in the green transition. So in electric vehicles, battery production, solar panels, and so on. And so in that instance, the commodities that are important for the energy transition will still be in high demand from China. And China will still look to secure strategic resources in those sectors. That means that countries that are already exposed to China and which have access to those minerals, let's say the DRC with copper and cobalt, for instance, will still benefit from Chinese demand. So I think that we really have to make a difference on those two fronts. If we look at the funding part, I think that there is definitely more risks. But then again, there is a differentiation according to the countries and the regions. So basically, we know that overall, the amount that China lends to the African continent has been reduced simply because there is reduced risk appetite in the Chinese economy and some domestic policy shifts as well. But then again, I mean, when historically most of the Chinese loans were directed towards countries in Southern and Eastern Africa, which have showcased very strong debt vulnerabilities, and that now we're seeing that the Chinese loans are directed towards West Africa, which are countries with stronger macroeconomic fundamentals, then basically the main takeout of this is that yes, there will be less loans overall, but there are countries on the African continent that will still benefit from quite strong financial support from China, and other countries that will benefit less from it. So there is also here a dual approach to be adopted. So this basically means that China's overall slowdown will not affect the continent in a very homogeneous way, and that basically for the continent overall it will be at the margin and stronger depending on the country profiles and their commodity profiles, as well as generally their macroeconomic fundamentals. I'll also add, yes, if I can also add something. This also does mean that some countries will have to look to reduce their dependence on China, but not only on China, on the rest of the world, basically, and that they will definitely do it through two main channels. One is more regional trade, that is still nascent, but it will increase in time. And second is through economic diversification, which is, I think, the most key point. Simply because, yes, Africa is very resource rich. Africa has a lot of commodities, but the misconception is that its greatest strength is commodities, which is not Africa's greatest strength. It is demographics. So by developing domestic demand is where you have a sustainable growth rate. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much. We close this roundtable with you, Seltem. Another election in March. So in Turkey, what kind of economic policy change would you expect in your country?
Well, we expect the policy set that has been introduced since the second half of last year to remain in place. So we don't expect the monetary tightening to stop or to halt. Probably the central bank will adopt a wait-and-see approach after raising its policy rate from 8.5% to 45%. So and if the inflationary pressures start coming down in the second half, then we can see the central bank starting a cutting cycle of its policy rate, but to a very gradual way and to a very small amount. On the other hand, after the elections, we can see tighter fiscal policy in order to support the tightness of the monetary policy impact on the inflation, and which means that there can be the introduction of new taxes and or increase in already existing tax levels. So this will also help to slow down private consumption, encouraging this inflationary process by improving the pricing behavior of the companies.
Thank you very much. I would like to add that our mission is with all these publication, economic study, presentation, that is to help company in their trade, to advise, to give them insight, make the companies informed to make a better decision. With our job, we are a leader in trade credit insurance and risk management, and also recognized partner in business information, bonding, single risk, and debt collection. Saying that, I would like to thank you all our economists for their work and their brilliant presentation as always. So thank you, Bruno, Marcos, Aroni, Seltem, and Laurine. Please remember for our guest that this is not the end of our conversation. Shortly you will receive an email with the recording of this webinar and also the presentation. Once again, thank you for attending to our webinar. We will continue to inform you with our publication and with this webinar. And we look forward forward to see you in the next webinar. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye bye.
Very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Have a good day. Bye.